A River Lost by Bragg. A River Lost by Bragg. Prologue. A River Lost is a story of an ancient culture forever changed by modern technology. It is the story of my son's tribe, the Arrow Lakes tribe, now part of the Colville Confederate Tribes. For thousands of years, this tribe's way of life revolved around the Columbia River and fishing for salmon at the river falls. All of this was taken away from them during the New Deal, when the Grand Coulee Dam was built. The dam had no fish ladders, hence the salmon could never return to this once fertile fishing site. The dam also wiped out an entire town of Inchilium with very little advance notice to the town's residents. Many elders of the tribe did not believe this could really happen, and therefore many of them did not move their homes out of the path of the oncoming water until the last possible moment. The Colville tribal members finally received payment promised to them when the dam was built in the 1930s on April 7th, 1995. They had to wait 65 years for their payment. Tupa refused to believe what was happening. I stood with my great-grandmother, Tupa, on the porch of the home she had lived in all her adult life. We watched the smoke rising from the fires below. As the night fell, the sky took on the yellow glow. Flickering orange flames lit up the horizon. Tupa's little clapboard cabin was nestled against the hillside on the banks of the river. Behind the rustic structures, brown hills dotted with sweet-smelling pine trees rolled upward toward the dense forests. Beyond the rickety front porch lay a mighty river that was the lifeline to our people. The acrid, smoky smell filled the night air. Houses that had not moved were being burned to make way for a man-made lake. The Indian agent had told the people of my tribe that they must move their entire village or it would be destroyed by the rising waters behind the grand dam the government had built. This massive concrete dam would change our way of life forever, taking us from our sacred river and precious salmon, or Intitiha. For thousands of years, my people had taken their food, traveled, and met at the river and the river's falls. The rocks below the falls had been hollowed out by the constant pummeling of the cascading river. These rocks, when full of water, looked like cooking kettles. Early fur traders called my people the Chandeliers, or the Kettle Indians. Each summer, families from our tribe traveled up the river to the falls in search of food. The summer encampments brought family tribes near and far to fish the river, trade, and visit friends and relatives. The falls had been an important meeting place for generations. In the old days, when the salmon were running and hundreds of teepees and lodges had lined the banks of the great river, coastal Indians crossed the Cascade Mountains and brought with them beautiful shells to trade. Plain Indians came across the Rocky Mountains bringing buffalo hides and dried meat to trade for salmon. In turn, families from my tribe had sometimes journeyed east into the plains to hunt the buffalo. Tupa folded her arms across her chest defiantly. How can man change rushing waters of a river into the still waters of a lake? She scoffed. Many of our elders, Tupa, could not accept what was happening. It did not seem possible that the man's actions could do this, turn our river and our land into a great lake. It was very difficult to convince great-grandmother that she must move. It was now time for Tupa to leave her home. The Grand Dam was finished. Soon the waters of the new lake would begin rising behind the dam. Tupa stayed in the house, refusing to watch as we harvested her beloved garden. Everything we wished to save had to be moved to higher ground. Homes, animals, gardens, and our church were moved. Even burial sites had to be dug up and moved uphill. Only when great-grandmother could see the water rising did she agree to leave her home. We had very little time before the rising tide of the water would flood the place where our village stood. As I helped Tupa pack her possessions, she seemed sad and was silent. Then, in the dust-covered box, she found an old picture of herself as a small girl at her family's summer camp near the falls. Her dark eyes grew bright with memories of her childhood as she began to speak. You know, Sinma. Tupa paused and leaned against a stack of boxes. Every summer, my family camped at the falls. When the salmon swam upstream to spawn, the water became so thick and matted with their red bodies that it looked like you could walk across the river on the backs of the Intitiha, or the salmon. It was my job to help my mother prepare for our summer home at the falls. Mother and I gathered cooking utensils, food, woven mats, and skins for bedding. Father picked his spears, gaff hooks, and baskets used for fishing at the falls. My baby brother was laced tightly into his cradleboard for the journey up the river. Our family traveled up the river as far as possible in a pine bark canoe that Father had stretched over the cedar frame. The river was calm at first, but soon became turbulent. When the water became too rough, we continued our trip to the falls on foot. Our home for the summer was a deer-skin teepee at the base of the falls. Once at the camp, my sinimat, Tupa continued, her eyes sparkling with life. Every person had chores to do. Even the littlest child helped by gathering firewood. My work was with Mother, setting up our shelter, cooking and drying the salmon in preparation for winter. But I loved to watch the men fish at the falls. Many salmon were caught in basket nets and traps made from the fir bogs. These nets and traps were stretched out across the falls to trap the fish as they leapt against the crashing cascade of water. Salmon that did not leap completely over the falls fell back into the woven baskets, nets, and traps. Most exciting was watching Father and the other men make their way out into the rushing, churning river over slippery, wet rocks. The men made their way into the narrow platforms made of 2 pieces of wood tied together with bark laces. Since there, they carefully perched over the falls with spears and gaff hooks. When a fish was caught, Father dropped down on his stomach for balance, twisted the barbs of the spear into the salmon's flesh. In this way, Father could catch 20 salmon per day. Another 300 or 400 fish were caught in the baskets and traps. Fishing in this manner was very dangerous. If a man slipped, he could get sucked into the rushing current below. The strong undertow could easily pull a grown man down, drowning him. If somehow he escaped the pull of the undertow, his body might be smashed against the rocks of the angry waters. In those days, every family in the tribe was rich with salmon. There was enough salmon caught to last each family until the next season. Some of the fish was eaten fresh, but most of it was dried. As a young girl, I helped the women hang the fish on drying racks, drying the salmon, preserved it through the cold, snowy winter. We celebrated the salmon run, feasting on the fresh roasted salmon and the freshwater crayfish that served up on trays made of wood of the willow tree. The feast also included huckleberries we girls and women picked from the hills, and kama roots dug in the valleys and steamed in underground pits. Sacks woven tightly from cedar and corn husks stored the dry salmon for a few meals. The salmon, or the intitiha, was our money. The fish held great value for us. We traded for hides from the plain tribes. Later, we traded salmon for flour and guns and food and tobacco from the settlers at the fort. Deer and buffalo hides were tanned and made into teepees, saddle blankets, bedding, robes, clothing, moccasins, and ropes. By trading salmon, roots, and berries from our lands for buffalo from the plains, our people had a great variety of foods to last all winter long. The salmon chief, Kinka ruled over the community of people who had come to the falls to fish and trade. He made sure that the salmon were shared fairly among all of the families. Kinka, our salmon chief, was respectful of his people, especially elders, women, and children. The people of the tribe took care of each other. They always shared with those in need. As more and more settlers were moved into our lands, the fish began to thin out. Each year, fewer salmon were caught at the summer encampments. As I grew older, it seemed there were more and more settlers and less salmon at the falls each year. Now, see Matt, Tupa sighed, and lowered her eyes to the faded picture clutched tightly in her wrinkled brown hands. She stared silently at the photograph for a long time. They tell us the salmon will not come at all. Tupa's words were true. There were no fish ladders in the dam that was built on our land across our river. The salmon would no longer come to the falls to spawn. Our river, our falls, our salmon, and our homes were to be taken by this dam. We were promised payment, but it would take the government over 50 years to fulfill this promise. We moved Tupa to a hill. The water rising behind the dam wiped out our village. It flooded the land where our houses stood at the banks of the river. Our people could not comprehend this, especially the elders. When the time came to flood our village, some of my people had only a few hours to move their belongings before the new lake took their homes. Tupa died before my tribe received any payment for what this dam had taken from us. Today, my people live on the shore of an enormous lake created by the largest dam in North America. A few elders remember what life was like when the salmon traveled up the mighty river from the ocean to the falls. When they are gone, there will be no one left to remember this way of life.